good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and a huge welcome to Produce, Mix, Fix and Conquer. So we've got a fantastic guest coming up very shortly, Mr. Ian Shepherd, who's been a mastering engineer since the 90s, and he's worked with some incredible artists such as Deep Purple and Keane. Ian also has a fantastic blog, which he's going to be telling us more about later. Also as well, Ian is also known for creating Dynamic Range Day, which I'm sure he's going to have a good chat with us about very shortly. So I know he's a massive advocate for dynamics in mastering as well. So do feel free to share this live with your friends. So we're on facebook.com/groups/produce, mix, fix and conquer. And also our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/produce, mix, fix and conquer. So without further ado, mastering engineer, Mr. Ian Shepherd. How you doing, Ian?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to have you. It's really cool. So how things are over your end? How's your week been so far?
Yeah, it's been good, just getting on with it.
Yeah. How's things been during COVID, during the lockdown over the last year and a half for you?
They've been fine, to be honest. It didn't have a huge impact on it. My wife and I both work from home. So we're that wasn't a big change. And yeah, I mean, I know some people have seen more business through COVID. I think there's been, a load of people in the music industry or especially the, prosumer or the amateur end of it, people saying, right, okay, now I'm going to make my album.
Yeah.
I didn't see that particularly, but also nothing fell off. So, I mean, I was lucky in that we were able to weather it pretty successfully. So that was good.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I was going to say it's been an interesting change to the whole music industry. Have you seen a big impact as well with artists sending music through to you as well? Have you seen an uplift? Because I know that many people went out and bought home studios as well. And has there been an uplift with professionals sending through work to you as well over the last few months?
Oh, over the last few months there has. What I was going to say was, I would say through the whole first lockdown, all the way up to the end of last year, kind of things didn't change that much. If anything, maybe a few more people were taking the courses and, paying attention to what I was doing there. And then, kind of since Christmas, there was definitely a lull. But I think after the summer, it's picked up. So, I mean, that could just be, now is traditionally the Christmas, well, we're out of the Christmas rush, right? But the summer always used to be the Christmas rush when everybody's trying to get their stuff done so that they could get it manufactured and out. But
yeah, sure.
Even that's less of a thing now because people don't have CDs and vinyl made so much. So, but yeah, I definitely have had more people approaching me just recently. So that's good.
Absolutely amazing. So good. Thanks for that, Ian. So, so like with our previous guests that we've been so honoured to have, like professionals such as yourself over the last few months and have really good chats and kind of explore their world. So really today, I'd love to explore your world. So maybe to start at the beginning. So where did you grow up and what sort of music were your parents getting you into as a kid as you were growing up?
So I grew up in Lowestoft, or just outside Lowestoft, which is in East Anglia. For anybody not in the UK, maybe some people in the UK as well, if you look at the UK, East Anglia is the lump on the side of the UK and Lowestoft is the tiny little bump on the edge of East Anglia. So it's the most easterly point in the UK, I think, certainly in England. The only other two claims to fame that it has that I know of are that Benjamin Britten was born there, a famous classical composer, and really important in the classical music scene in Suffolk in particular, the county. And The Darkness came from there as well. I'm sure you have come across The Darkness. They're a kind of hair metal band in the tradition of, I don't know, Queen and Styx and all those kind of. But what? When were they having stuff? Maybe 10 years ago, they kind of suddenly started hitting the charts and they had a Christmas #1 and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, those are the three claims to fame. So I grew up in the, just on the coast, and I hated it as a kid, but now I just love going back there. It's a beautiful part of the world. Very cool.
Amazing. So what sort of music were your parents getting you into then? Yeah.
I was going to say my parents didn't. Well, okay. So nobody's ever asked me that before. So my parents were massively into opera.
Yeah.
So when my brother and I were young, we would actually ask them to put Pavarotti on at full blast when we went to sleep because we really liked the sound of it kind of coming up through the floorboards. But I wasn't so much into Pavarotti. They tried to get me to like Tchaikovsky, that like 1812 overture and that kind of, they thought I would, I mean, I think the first music that I really connected with was probably film music. But, and I do remember my dad put me onto Jean-Michel Jarre.
Nice.
Not because he liked it, but because he thought I would like it. Because I was, I don't know, by the time I was maybe 10, no, younger, 8 or 9, I was a huge Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fan. I was a massive sci-fi fan, so I was into Star Wars and Star Trek and all that stuff. So Hitchhikers was right up my street. And the sound design in that is amazing. I mean, the first time I ever realized what stereo was listening to that show. I imagine most people listening to this know about it, but just in case you haven't come across it, it's a kind of sci-fi comedy series by Douglas Adams. And it was originally, lots of people don't know this because it became a book and it became a TV series and then a movie, but it was originally a radio drama with sound effects and music by the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, the same people who did the Doctor Who theme and all those amazing sci-fi sound effects there. But yeah, there was one scene in that where the starship Heart of Gold lands on the planet Magrathea, and at some point this spaceship flies from one. I was sitting curled up on the sofa listening to it on headphones, and this spaceship flies from one ear through to the other. And I kind of looked around at my dad and was like, "The spaceship just did," and he was like, "Yeah, that's stereo. I'll tell you about that later." So yeah, that's the first, and kind of, I mean, from then on, I've just, for whatever reason, thought music and sound is cool. And stereo is particularly something that I really, really love. So I'm really enjoying the whole kind of binaural Atmos thing that's going on at the moment. And I enjoyed doing surround sound stuff for DVD kind of earlier in my career. So anyway, that's jumping ahead. But
yeah.
So the first album I remember buying was Kings of the Wild Frontier by Adam and the Ants, which is kind of art punk stuff, 78 maybe, no 80 81. But at the same time, the first cassette I ever had for my Walkman was the musical Cats by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I taped somebody else's copy of Equinox and Oxygen by Jean-Michel Jarre, and then I got into, I don't know, Marillion and Jethro Tull and all this kind of hair metal, all this stuff that, like, for years I was too embarrassed to mention, and now I'm just like, oh, what the hell? I was a kid. So, but I had eclectic tastes, I would say. I mean, back then, we didn't have Spotify or any of this stuff, but I would go to the library and I would just take records out based on whether I liked the cover or not. Yeah. So, which is actually a really good way of, it's kind of like the most bizarre random playlist you could imagine on a file streaming service these days. But so I listen to all kinds of stuff.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. So instrument wise as well, as a kid, did you pick up an instrument? And if so, what was your first instrument that you picked up?
Trombone.
Cool. Amazing.
Yeah. They came around the school. They said, does anybody want to play an instrument? And I just randomly put up my hand and said trumpet. The teacher, I went along for a lesson. He said, no, your mouth's not the right shape for trumpet. But you could play euphonium, which is kind of like a half-sized tuba, if you like, kind of upright thing. So I played that for a while, and it got to the point where really I needed my own instrument, and my parents, euphoniums are incredibly expensive. And so I switched to trombone because the instruments were more affordable. So I played, and it was weird because I was always massively into music, and I guess I enjoyed playing the trombone, but I never really got into it until I was about 16 or 17, and a space opened up on the local youth orchestra, and I went to a residential course for a week in Derbyshire with them, and we played, I think we played Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, funnily enough. I mentioned Tchaikovsky before. An American in Paris by Gershwin, this incredible kind of jazzy thing, and I just, from that point on, I was hooked, and to the extent that I had taken just maths and sciences for my A levels, which is the qualifications you take when you're 16 plus in the UK, and I actually got quite down about it because I don't know, I don't want to do this, And my parents said, well, look, take another year, go and do a music course and see what you want to do with that. And I'm so thankful that they did, because that, I got to explore that side of things more fully at that point. And then I got halfway through that course and I was like, well, now I'm depressed because I don't want to do, I'm not good enough to be a professional musician. I don't want to be a music teacher. But also I don't want to give up music. So what am I going to do? And I ended up getting on. These days there are music technology courses. It's amazing. If you want to learn what we do, there's just a ton of options for people out there. But back then there was nothing. So I think there were 3 courses in the UK. And I got on one of them. So I did literally physics and music, and the 2 were completely separate, apart from a few acoustics lectures that we had. But I basically spent the entire second year. They had a studio there, and I just spent it recording albums for bands that my mates were in, and then working on the live sound crew. So that was my first introduction to what I ended up becoming my career.
Amazing, that's so cool. With so obviously you were recording first, then mixing. So how did you fall into the world of mastering? Was it shortly after that point, or was it a while after that point? And what was your journey during that point?
It was a mistake. Well, not a mistake, but basically, so yeah, I did the degree course, and left college not really knowing what I wanted to do. My wife, my now wife, but then my girlfriend, and we went to Luxembourg for a while, and she was teaching English as a foreign language, and I was going to tutor the kids of expats in physics and maths. That was the plan. But while I was there, before I left, I had sent out, I don't know, I used to say 200, but thinking about it, it can't have been 200. Anyway, a lot of letters to studios, basically anywhere in the country that I thought it would be cool to live.
Sure.
And I had been working for free there at a studio just around the corner from where my parents lived, a community studio, basically, tied up with the local arts college.
Yeah.
And yeah, I got this call when I was in Luxembourg saying, oh, there's this opportunity if you want to come and do it. And I'd been super lucky because they had phoned, that I'd given the reference, was the guy who worked at the studio where I'd been working. They phoned him and he said, well, I don't want to tell you where he is because I want to employ him. But he was also an incredibly honest person. And he said, but realistically, that's not going to happen. So, but that's a really cool way to, before they even speak to me, they've got this idea that I knew what I was doing, or I was a useful person to have around. So I came back from Luxembourg, and the thing was, I had never heard of this. So there was the White Book back then. I don't even know if it still exists. It was a directory of all of the audiovisual services in the UK. It's probably an online directory now.
Yeah.
And yeah, this was it was listed as vinyl and cassette duplication. So it was a long shot as far as I was, but it was near Cambridge, which my wife, who was then my girlfriend, and I both, loved the city, and because that's where we'd met when I was at college. So yeah, I was kind of like, okay, and the guy talking said, oh no, we're not doing cassette and vinyl duplication anymore. This is a mastering house. And I don't even know how much he told me about it. I was like, well, he said, and it was true, that they were basically an independent competitor to Abbey Road. Now that's probably building their part up a bit in terms of the profile and all the rest of it. But the company was called SRT, and it was one of the UK's leading independent mastering facilities. There were maybe, I guess, 4 or 5 at the time, and it was definitely, right up there at the top of the list. And they had just landed a contract with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra to record 200 albums, I think, which was the biggest classical recording deal ever at that point. Probably even still. So they were expanding massively and they needed more staff. So I wasn't involved in that project, but I did get taken on at the age of 21 as a trainee mastering engineer, which is really unusual. A lot of mastering engineers will have worked for years as recording or mixing engineers or producers and then kind of make the move. Whereas I was basically trained from the ground up. And the funny thing is, with hindsight, it was just perfect for me because, even before, when I've been listening to all the hair metal and stuff, I was constantly tweaking the speaker setup, and I would take cassettes apart and rebuild them to get the tape to clamp onto the heads more to get better high frequency response. And end of side distortion on vinyl always bugged me. So I was, very much focusing on things that actually are kind of what mastering engineers worry about all the time, so with hindsight, I don't think I would have made a great recording or mixing engineer, to be fair. I think one of the things I like about mastering is that more often than not, you've got a day. When I was working at SRT, you did 2 albums a day. You had a session in the morning and a session in the afternoon. These days I can make my own schedule, so I take it a bit easier. But so you just, it's great. You get to come in at the end of the process and say, oh no, you should have done it like this. And, the clients go, wow, thank you so much. And you feel like, but actually, if all the hard work has already been done, we're just putting the icing on the cake.
Yeah, makes sense. That's amazing. Thanks so much for that, Ian. So, with the discography then, so obviously look through your discography and, obviously when I've listened to your podcasts or by the way, with your podcast, maybe we can have a chat about that in a few minutes, but the amount of times that I've listened to your podcast in the car and thinking, I wonder how that works, and just looked up an episode, which I found really, really helpful, which is absolutely brilliant. So maybe we'll explore more about that in a moment. But thinking about your discography as well, so you work with some amazing artists like Keane and Deep Purple as well. So I know it's probably really hard to choose highlights, but maybe let's explore Deep Purple. So how did you get involved with those guys and with the mastering and that side of things as well? And how many albums did you do with them? Was it 2 albums, 3 albums, was it?
Okay, so this is where I have to be completely authentic with you. My discography, like lots of people's, looks fantastic. The reality is slightly less glamorous. So I didn't actually get to work with Deep Purple or Keane. I have worked with loads of other artists who are on the discography. One of the things about working for an indie is that you don't get a huge amount of major record label stuff.
Sure.
Because they tend to have their own. So for example, Sony at the time had Whitfield Street. So all their mastering work would go through there. So, you kind of pick up an interest. I got to work with some fantastic people. I worked with Stephen Wilson, who was then with Porcupine Tree, on the enhanced CD single of something that he was working on, track called Piano Lessons. So I did the video encoding, I did the interactive design for the enhanced CD section, and I mastered a couple. The main mastering for the single had already been done, but I mastered a couple of bonus tracks. So Deep Purple, I mixed a concert from Stuttgart, if I remember correctly. It was a double album. There was one of them that they already had a mix, and so I had to master it, or maybe it had already been mastered even by somebody else. But the Deep Purple thing was actually a full mix of the concert, but it was a live gig from back in the day. So I didn't get to work directly with the guys. And the Keane project was the Ultimate Edition reissue. So basically it was... Now, I do have a claim to fame on that. I'll come to that. So disc 1, it was a 2-disc set. Disc 1 was the album Hopes and Fears, which is their first and probably their most famous album. And then the second disc was a collection of BBC sessions, basically. So Peel sessions, Joe Wiley, all stuff from the archive there, which was a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic challenge. The interesting thing about that was that listening to disc 1, I realized that it was actually mastered super loud. It's not something that had ever bothered me before. I was a huge fan of the album. It had never bothered me before. One of the things about mastering, as you know, is most music has what you would call a loudness potential. Where, if you want something to be super loud and still sound good, you need to have that in mind from the beginning of the production process.
Sure.
In the case of this album, that was not the case for the BBC sessions. They sounded good, but they hadn't been recorded and mixed with that in mind. So when I tried to master them, I just felt like to push them all up to the same level as the CD would compromise what I was able to achieve with them, because they just didn't have the potential to get that dense.
Makes sense.
So then I had this huge dilemma of, what do I do? Do I have disc 1 be louder than disc 2? I might even be that there are some bonus tracks on the end of disc 1, potentially on the end of the original album, I think. So was I going to have it step down? And in the end, I had a conversation with the producer at the record label, and we agreed that I could turn the original CD down by a dB and a half or something, just to give myself a little bit more room to work with. The reason I say that, and this was with Fear and Trepidation, because this is one of the biggest selling albums of all time, right?
Sure.
And I'm going and saying, no, I'm going to turn it down. That's, with hindsight, that's a fairly ballsy move.
Very much
but
so.
the interesting thing is nobody ever noticed. Actually, no, that's not true. A couple of people noticed, and they said, "Oh, it sounds a bit more dynamic." It wasn't any more dynamic. It was just slightly lower in level. But nobody complained, which kind of adds, to my whole thing of loudness in that sense is not. The overall level is not that important, Listeners, music fans don't care. It's all about how it sounds. So high points often are the little kind of, not the big name stuff is difficult because you tend to have a lot of constraints, and you very often you don't get to work with the artists because it just gets sent to you at the final stage. I mean, I think if you were working for a major record label, I'm sure Coldplay work directly with their mastering engineer, for example, or whatever it might be. But the really cool stuff is where you do get to work with people. So I did some little the studio that I worked at doubled up. I was in a mastering room, but we had the glass going through to a live room beyond it, which had a Steinway C piano in it. It didn't have a ton of kind of isolation booths or any of that kind of stuff, but it was really nicely set up for small acoustic setups, small jazz kind of. I mean, you could record a band in there, but it was a kind of a live, noisy kind of thing. But I did some really good. It's funny because I had no experience of jazz, but over the years I've worked on a ton of it, and I've really come to appreciate the musicianship, and often the how eclectic all the musicians are. I find that, you'll get, I don't know, an EDM artist or a metal artist, and they're like, well, I won't listen to that because it's, and most people wouldn't hear the difference between the two genres they were talking about. Whereas I remember one session I was recording these jazz guys, and they couldn't get this bit right, and then one of them suddenly said, it's more like Stevie Wonder, and they all went, oh, okay, and got a perfect take, and they all understood that reference, and they would know about all kinds. Anyway, I'm getting off the point. I did an album called Lovers and Strangers for a guy called Hans Koller, who was a jazz pianist, and it had an amazing vocalist called Christine Tobin, and her husband Phil on there. I've forgotten the name of the bass player, it's bass, vocals, stand-up bass, vocals, drums, African percussion, harp. Right, that's an amazing lineup.
That's so cool.
of acoustic, because for me the real challenge is acoustic instruments. It's like you can do distorted guitar tones and you can record synths, and drums are always a challenge. An acoustic drum set, because it's like 15 to 20 instruments in one part of the room, but to put in a harp and a stand-up bass and piano, an acoustic piano, all in the same room, but it just working through that, it came out so well. Things like that are a real highlight often.
Brilliant, that's amazing. Thanks so much for that, Ian. It's fantastic. I've got to ask you then, so obviously you've touched on dynamics as well, so we've got so many questions to ask you about mastering, but however, so dynamics, I know that you're a massive advocate of dynamics, so much so that you've done Dynamic Range Day. So tell us about how Dynamic Range Day came about, and as I know that a lot of your followers obviously know all about it, but maybe a lot of our community don't. So tell us more about how it all works.
So first of all, I'll say that I'm a fan of balanced dynamics.
Okay.
It can be just as much of a problem to have too much in the way of dynamics as to have not enough. But most stuff these days doesn't have enough in the way of dynamics, in my opinion. The loudness has been pushed right up, and that means there's no room for the music to breathe. So most of the time, it's fairly well. There's two sides of it, right? On the one hand, there's me kind of not wanting to have to master my stuff too loud so that it, in my opinion, impacts the quality of the results. Yeah. And then there's lots of stuff out there that I think has been pushed way too far, and it has impacted the results. But then almost everything that gets brought to me, I make it louder and I reduce the dynamics. But that's part of the process. That's part of the mastering process, and that's it's important to help it to sit together and to translate to multiple playback systems, all that kind of stuff. So Dynamic Range Day was, I remember you mentioned that you'd had Bobcats on.
It is. Yes.
I remember back in the back in the well, when did I start? I started out working in 94,
Yeah.
and probably we got set up with internet in the studios, I guess, later on in the 90s. I can't remember exactly. But back then, you didn't have Gearspace, you didn't have Facebook, but there was this thing called the Mastering Web Board, which was an online forum. And it was incredibly clunky by modern standards. But there were a ton of great... Bobby Azinski was on there. Glenn Meadows was on there. Noah Mintz was on there. There were a bunch of really quite big name mastering engineers all just talking about stuff. So, and we as in the studio, we would bring in releases to see what everything else was like. And I remember hearing the first Portishead album, and the Oasis albums, were incredibly loud, and Californication by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. There was towards the end of the 90s, heading into 2000, was kind of when this stuff was building up to its peak. So loudness was really, we'd put it on and kind of go, how did they do that? And then you would turn it down and listen to it, and it was like, oh, okay, they did it by adding quite a lot of distortion, or whatever it was. But yeah, the guys on the web board, including Bob Katz, I mean, he was already advocating for more or balanced dynamics back then.
Yeah.
So, my kind of interest to that just continued. But what really kicked it off was, so I started my blog as an experiment because I hated cold calling. Things were starting to get tough in the mastering industry. I guess, mid 2000s. And yeah, we were being asked as engineers, oh, can you, call people up and see if they'd be interested in getting mastering work done? Sure, and I hated that idea so much. I was reading about the potential for, you put useful information up online, people read it and like it, and they end up coming to you to have the work done. So I started a little blog on Blogspot to kind of experiment with that myself. And in whatever year it was, Metallica released Death Magnetic, which has become something of a poster child for the loudness war. But I have to take some credit for that, or be blamed for that to a certain extent, because I wrote some blog. So it was a really, I mean, I don't know whether your audience or your community know all about this, but just briefly, the thing was, it was a super loud album. It was super distorted, but the soundtrack was also released on Guitar Hero, which was this gaming platform on a PS4 PlayStation. Anyway, and the version on PlayStation wasn't. It had been sent. The files had obviously been sent off much earlier in the production process, and they were much cleaner. And the fans noticed almost immediately and started ripping the stems off of the machine and remixing it themselves. And I saw some forum posts about this. And the other really interesting thing that happened was that a fan emailed Ted Jensen, who worked at Sterling at the time. Yeah. And he off the record, he mastered the album, and he off the record said, yeah, I'm not proud of this, but it is what it is. And the fan, without his permission, posted this on a Metallica forum. And that's what I found out about. And I kind of started off thinking, what, the game sounds different? That's not going to happen. Yeah. But then I started listening to the files and got interested, and I started blogging about it. And within about a week, another Ian, who wasn't me, had started a petition to have it remixed and remastered. And I think it was Music Radar spotted it first, and then Wired magazine picked up on it and started linking to my blog, and it ended up in the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian, and all. It just exploded. Wow. It just went viral. Yeah. So ever since then, a lot of people, kind of reading my site and all the rest of it, have been interested in those issues, and I'm interested in them as well. So it's just been this kind of theme that's carried on. But at some point, I saw it was two things. There was Derek Sivers, who's the guy who founded CD Baby. Yep. He found a video. There's this video. It was a viral video of this. It was a festival somewhere on the side of a mountains, and this one guy, kind of just drunk, gets up and starts dancing like a complete nutter to whatever music is going on. And then his mate gets up and joins in. And within about 2 or 3 minutes, there's this massive crowd of people all just raving wildly on the side of this hill. And Derek picked up on this and was like, you need leaders in any, wherever you want to be. actually, he was talking about being the second person. He wasn't talking about being the first person doing the crazy thing. He was talking about being the first person to pick up on this cool thing.
Yeah,
He was talking about the guy. Anyway, that was happening. And at the same time, this is a very long answer. I apologize.
No, that's cool. Go for
there's a guy called Seth Godin, who some people will know about it. He invented the term permission marketing, right? So he invented the idea that instead of spamming people with adverts and just blasting them, it was a better idea to ask their permission so that they would say, yes, I would like you to send me stuff. Mm-hmm. So then if you're sending people information and eventually you send them ideas about products and services, it was the kind of the beginning. He's kind of the father of online marketing in the kind of cool, non-sleazy way, you know? So you don't have to kind of feel like, oh, I'm forcing this stuff on people, you know? They asked to be told about this stuff, so it's good. And he put up a blog post about declaring a holiday. He said, if there's a cause that you feel passionate about and that your audience feel passionate about, declare a holiday. And for some reason, those two things, they happen quite close to each other. And I read this and I was like, well, I could do that. People would like that if I did Dynamic Range Day. And then I thought, well, who am I to do that? You know, I'm just this mastering engineer who has a blog and happened to write about Metallica. And then I kind of thought, well, why not?
Yeah.
So I just did it as a joke, or not as a joke, but originally the whole idea was that everybody was just going to type in all caps all day, right? Which is shouting on the internet. And the idea was that it would be annoying and people would ask you why. And then you could explain, well, this is like making your music really loud all the time and it's not nice to have it shout. And so people loved it. I mean, the people doing it loved it, but everybody else found it super annoying. And the message didn't really get across. So in the second year, at some point SSL came in and offered an X-Desk, a really cool prize for a competition to help publicize it. I can't remember whether that was the second or the third year, but at that point I just kind of, you know, people enjoyed it, so I wanted to do it again. And it was raising awareness of the issue, and that was all good. And then SSL came in and offered this prize for the competition, and it spiraled from there. And now we've had the 10-year anniversary. It'll be the 11th or 12th year next year when I run it. So it's just a way of raising awareness. So I don't do the competition anymore. I had the feeling that lots of people were in it for the competition and not for the missing out on the point of the exercise. But I still do the award, where every year I try and find a selection of, you know, ideally mainstream, commercially successful albums that have great dynamics. Mm-hmm. Just to use as examples. So if anybody's interested in this, if you go to dynamicrangeday.com/award, you can see there the award winners and more importantly, all the nominees over the years. And, you know, there's Björk, there's Stephen Wilson, there's Opeth, metal band, there's the whole, and from a whole load of different genres. There's kind of rap and hip hop on there. There's all this stuff where people go, no, it's got to be super loud or it won't sell and people won't like it. And this page is full of examples of things that, I mean, they're still loud, you know, but they're what I would say is in the sweet spot where they're not too loud. They're just loud enough and they sound amazing and they have been commercially successful and people do love them. So completely. That's kind of the message of the thing, is just to try and get people aware of this.
Man, thanks so much. That's brilliant. I was going to say as well, as I know that one of the winners, if I'm right in saying this, was Glenn Schick. It was one of the winners of Dynamic Range Day. What really interested me about this, especially maybe for mastering engineers getting into mastering, and maybe university students, or maybe people think, you know what, I really want to give mastering a go, but I don't want to upset my neighbors. And you probably know where I'm going with this, that Glenn is obviously now famous for mastering under headphones, which I know in the mastering world was a big, almost a no-no. It was almost taboo to master under headphones, but yet he's managed it and won awards and God knows what. So what are your thoughts on mastering under headphones? I know that it's maybe a while since you did that interview with Glenn, but have you had any thoughts after that interview about mastering under headphones at all?
I haven't really had any more thoughts, but I haven't really kind of changed I mean, I don't want to do it. Yeah. I enjoy working on speakers. Sure. That's how I was trained and how I worked for the first 15 years of my career. So it's very much ingrained in how I think about music, how I hear music. But I mean, one thing about headphones is they take the room out of the equation. I mean, not only does Glenn master on headphones, but he masters on a laptop.
Yeah.
Which is another, there's a whole kind of section of the mastering community who will tell you it's impossible to do good mastering work without analog gear. And I don't believe that either.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Especially not these days. Maybe back in the day, you could have made a stronger argument for that. But where was I going with that? Yeah,
about the mastering community. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Glenn, in terms of mastering on headphones, it's not to my taste. But if I had spent 10 years, I mean, one thing to say is that the headphones that Glenn is mastering on costs thousands of pounds.
Yeah. Sure.
So that kind of, on the one hand, it's attractive because, okay, you don't need a mastering room, but you do still need to invest a huge. Having said that, I did the home mastering master course that I run using these Sennheiser HD650s, which are
headphones.
Very good headphones. They're not stupidly expensive. They're a few £100s. And especially if you use something like SonarWorks, the headphone calibration software, if you get a bespoke personalized profile so you actually buy the headphones with the profile, so that profile is made for the specific pair you have. They get even more accurate. There's super low distortion as well, which I think is a really important thing that lots of people miss in the headphones equation. So definitely. I mean, one concern I have about mastering on headphones is I think I said this on the podcast, when I tried mastering on headphones, there's a temptation for me to end up cranking it too loud because you miss that physical feedback that you get from the speakers. And I think maybe but maybe that's how I learned it. Maybe if I'd spent 10 or 15 years with a really high quality pair of headphones learning how to master, I might feel exactly the opposite. I mean, Glenn started out in a traditional mastering room and changed over to headphones. So I think, it's absolutely viable. Clearly it's viable because he's doing it. There are other, more and more people doing it.
Yeah.
In some ways it's kind of better because it takes the room out of the equation, and getting a really good sounding room is a real challenge. So yeah, I think particularly if people want to, and certainly, I mean, it's something that I recommend on the course is, because one of the big challenges of mastering is, especially if you're mastering your own stuff, it's let's say there's a dip in the frequency response in your room because of the acoustics at 70 hertz. The temptation is you're going to push way too much 70 hertz in to try and compensate for that. And Absolutely. It might sound fine in your room, but then you take it out to the rest of the world where there isn't that big dip. Suddenly it'll sound weird, excuse me, and overblown. So that's what we mean by translation, in terms of the goal of mastering is to get it so that it's going to sound good on all those systems out there. I've lost my thread again. What was I saying just before I started talking about the...
No, you were talking as well about the so you're talking about mastering on the headphones, but how you said that so how it works is the fact that obviously you've been doing mastering in a room and you're used to the room itself and like how it feeds back to you as well.
Thank you. You've reminded me. That's what. So what I was going to say is, if you've been working on your own stuff in a room that has a floor, but then you come to master it, one of the goals of mastering, often people will bring that stuff to me and I listen to it on my monitoring setup and go, oh, okay, so there's a dip at 70 hertz. We need to correct that. Or there's a boost at 70 hertz, whatever it might be. Sure. So you're correcting for possible deficiencies in the monitoring chain and the listening environment earlier on in the process. But if you're working on your own stuff and you're still in the same room, that's a real challenge because you're still hearing it with those, with that dip in the monitoring or whatever it is. Maybe the speakers don't have quite enough high frequency stuff, so you're putting too much or maybe they're really bright speakers, so you're not putting quite enough high end in there.
Yeah.
One thing that you can do, I mean, the one thing I suggest is everybody should use reference tracks. So bring other stuff that sounds amazing to you everywhere else bring it in and compare it. And then if it in your room sounds a bit dull, well, then you've got to make everything sound a bit dull to get it to sound right in the outside world. But the other thing you can do is get a really high quality pair of headphones, because that will, that's a way of changing your perspective, changing the way that you're hearing the music, without having to have a dedicated mastering room. So I guess, I was saying to some extent, I suggest that to people, if only as an alternative. I think you need to be careful if you have too many, you know, if you listen to it on a smartphone and in your car and on headphones and on 3 sets of speakers, you can get completely lost.
Absolutely agree.
If you have 1 or 2 ways of listening that you know really well, then you've got a good chance of getting a good result.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Ian. I've got to ask you as well, though, so talking about room acoustics, I did watch on YouTube a couple of episodes that you put on there about building your awesome garage studio. So, you know, how, amazing. But so how did it come about? Were you in a commercial space? And then did you think, right, I want to work from home? But I think you did that before lockdown, if that's right. You actually created this. Yeah, so how long have you been in there now, and how did it all come about?
Well, I've had this room for over 10 years now. So no, what happened was I was working for the company SRT. So they trained me up as a mastering engineer, and I worked there for 15 years.
Yeah.
It got to the end of that period, and there were some personal difficulties, and also I saw an opportunity to move. We'd been doing surround sound for DVD, and we'd been doing DVD authoring, and I had kind of that had been something I'd moved sideways into. So I was doing DVD authoring and audio mastering at the same time, and I saw an opportunity to move into Blu-ray. At that point, it was just when all of that was first happening. And they were very resistant to the idea, and eventually it got to the point I was just like, oh, forget it, I'm leaving. And I left to set up my own place, and I wasn't doing mastering at that point. I was just doing Blu-ray authoring. Well, actually, I also had some old mastering clients who still wanted to work with me, so I would go back into SRT and pay them for the use of the room. And then they went bust. You know, I'm not connecting that with me leaving. Clearly, there was all kinds of stuff going on. But basically, that just threw everything up in the air. It meant I could recontact because I had a term in my contract that said I wasn't allowed to contact old clients for a year after leaving. You know, it wasn't, which is fair enough. But obviously, the company had ceased to be, so I was able to do that at that point. So I was able to reconnect with a bunch of my existing clients. But also, I didn't have the room that I'd been working out of all those years. I was really lucky that an old colleague of mine who'd left 5 or 6 years earlier had actually set up a studio in the garden of his garden, basically built a mastering room, and had not the same monitors that I had, but a set of monitors that I also knew I could trust and that I was pretty familiar with there. So for a long time, I was hiring his place to do the mastering work, but that got really difficult because, I mean, it was only half an hour away. But, you know, one of the things, you know, when you're working as a mastering engineer, people send you stuff, and one of the most common questions is, will this benefit from mastering? And for me, it's got to the point where I can often listen to something and kind of go, yeah, I think so, or nah, that you'll be fine. And usually it's, I think so. But to know I find it really hard to think without my fingers on the faders. So it, you know, and people would want that answer quickly. And it's like, it's not a great response to get from a potential mastering engineer. I'd love to answer that question for you, but I need to wait 4 days until I can get back into the studio.
Yeah, sure.
And I just thought I need somewhere that I can a decent listening environment that I can listen to, and that was where the idea for this room came from. So, you know, we knew we needed to move house, so we were looking for somewhere. It turned out, so this used to be the garage for the American. Luckily, because of the way the house is designed, next to this there was, well, actually it was completely separated. There was a carport, I guess.
Oh, right.
Right. So there's the studio here, and then there was actually another empty space, and then the kitchen, and then the main house. So lots of physical distance from me, from everybody else, so they wouldn't disturb me and I wouldn't disturb them. We ended up, so we converted the carport into, there's a storage area and just a utility room thing out there. So still lots of, that big air gap is a nice piece of free soundproofing, if you like. I mean, the room's not soundproofed, which is one of the good things that enables it to sound good, because, you know, the truth is, the day the paint dried, I couldn't wait. You know, I'd had all my gear in boxes in another room. I brought it all in here, set it all up, put some CDs, and thought, oh crap, it sounds dreadful. We've just spent, I mean, it wasn't an enormous amount of money, but we've just spent a good amount of money converting this room for me to use, and I can't listen to music in here. And then literally the next day, the acoustic panels, I mean, there's more in front of me than above me that you can't see, but the acoustic treatment that I had ordered from GIK Acoustics arrived, and I put all of that in, and it was like, oh, thank God, I can definitely, and actually it sounds pretty good. And over the years since then, actually, it sounds way better than, I think I just got lucky.
Brilliant.
One of the things about acoustics and soundproofing is the more sound you keep out, the more sound you're keeping in, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a studio where you have a ton of soundproofing, then you're also going to have a ton of acoustic problems, because all of that sound that comes out of the speakers is bouncing around in the space inside and needs to be managed much more. If you have a room like this, where actually quite a lot of the sound goes out of the window that's in front of me, and even the walls are not that thick, because it was only originally a garage. But I'm lucky because it's the cricket pitch over there, and the cricketers don't care.
Brilliant.
And there's fields out the back. So,
nice.
And what that means is that you get it's a lot easier to make the room sound good. So a combination of that bit of luck. I always think this room is probably a bit like a bass gun. I reckon I'm shooting all of the bass out to the cricket pitch over there. But the acoustic panels brought everything else, brought the reverb times down and gave me the absorption I needed. So it sounds amazing. So I was super lucky. And I mean, when it came to lockdown, actually, I can get really good results in here. I can, people sent me stuff that's been mastered by some of the biggest places in the country, and I've been able to get results they were happier with. So, it's amazing what you can achieve. I'm not sure I would sell the blueprints for this place to anybody, because I don't think it would ever work again, but it worked out well for me.
Amazing. So good. Thanks, Ian. I was going to say, I suppose if you're one of the cricketers, have you ever had any cricketers knock on your door and say, excuse me, I missed a shot because of you and your loud bassiness, or I don't know. I'm doubting that's happened to you. But
they usually play at the weekends, and I try not to work at the weekends. So
right, okay.
We're okay.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. I know that you're a Wavelab user as well. So I know I was just talking to Justin Perkins the other week, interviewing him on here as well. And obviously I know that he's like, the poster boy at the minute on Stybo for Wavelab. But Wavelab, I use it as well. So what is it about Wavelab that you like with the workflow? I know that on your course that you advocate, and rightly so, that you can use any DAW, but what is it about Wavelab that you like with your workflow and for the work that you do for your clients?
So for the 15 years that I was working at SRT, I was working on a piece of software called SADI, Studio Audio Digital Editor, which there were two bits of software back then that were kind of bespoke mastering, or really kind of honed in on the mastering niche. So it was SADI and it was Sonic Solutions, and one reason I like Wavelab is it was in the early days, at least, it was a bit of a SADI ripoff, if I'm honest.
Right. Okay.
Even to the point of the waveforms were coloured in similar colours. I mean, it did. I remember at the time testing it and going, "Whoa, you can get this for 300 quid, and SADI costs you. A SADI system is going to be 10 grand plus. What's that going to do for our industry?" And that was obviously just the tip of the iceberg, and that was back in the mid 90s. But other important stuff that Wavelab and SADI had, one of them was DDP support. So DDP is Disk Description Protocol. And that was the format that you needed to export the audio in to get CDs pressed from. You can press CDs from a burned CD, but it's risky. You can get errors on the disc that then get transferred to the master and stuff. So we would, back in the day, first of all, I was mastering onto big old video tapes, basically U-matic video cartridges. So digital tapes, analog tapes with digital audio recorded on them. Then it moved on to things called exabytes, which were like the little kind of more like a, I don't know, there's a video format for them as well. But anyway, they were only about this big. Same thing, but it was stored on there as a file, and you send those to the plants. And these days you can export a DDP image directly to hard disk, zip it up and FTP it or Dropbox it, in my case, wherever you want. So Wavelab had really good DDP support built in. That was important to me. It also, it just has everything I need. It's in terms of like, it's really good for the metadata. I'm sure Justin mentioned that. You know, you can put all the track names and things in, and it'll get exported correctly to the right files automatically. All of that is a no-brainer. It supports ISRC codes, which are important for getting royalties if you get airplay. Really fine control of the markers that go on it. So especially on a CD player, you can't, if you skip to a track on a CD player, you can't guarantee that it will hit sample accurately the point that you chose. There's always a bit of error. So you want to place the marker carefully so that it's just before what you want to do. Silly stuff like crossfade shapes. You know, if I'm, you know, I started out mastering tape to tape, so I literally had a fader to do my fades with. But working in a computer, you might choose not, I mean, you know, lots of people still master that way, going out to an analog loop and back in. And I don't know whether they do their fades by hand, to be honest, in that case. But if you're going to use a computer to do the fade shape, you need a ton of flexibility and things like that. So yeah, it was all these little things, great metering, you know, really good loudness metering, really good spectrogram and frequency response metering, phase scope, all this kind of stuff, all in one package. And the key thing for me, in fact, going back to my story, was at the point where I no longer had a mastering studio that I could hire because they closed down. And I was going to work at my old colleague's place. He was a Mac. He was a PC, and I was a Mac. And Wavelab had, with version 8, I think it was, had gone cross-platform. So I could literally work on the stuff at his place, save it all to a hard drive, bring it back here, open it straight back up, and carry on. You know, so for example, you know, if I was working there for a day to get the basic sound right, or working with a client, then I could bring the stuff back. And then 3 days later, they say, oh, actually, could we just have that gap half a second longer, or could we just pull the level of that back ever so slightly? And rather than have to go back to his place and have more delays, I could tweak it here, re-export it, and save it out. So, you know, those were the factors. But I mean, I have to say, Wavelab is really deep, really powerful. It's improving all the time. I know that Justin had some reservations, but I think they're, you know, with kind of earlier versions, and I don't know whether he's changing the way that he works. But as far as I'm concerned, it does everything that I need, all in one software package, which just kind of, that's the way I always used to work, and that's the way I still like to work.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Ian. So I know that, so when we talked to Justin, he uses, I don't know if you've seen this actually, but he uses Reaper as part of his mastering process, then also uses Wavelab as well. So it's quite fascinating to see the two together. No, thanks so much for that. So using like your DAW as well, I know that you said that you do you do everything in the box, or do you use sub-outboard, or how do you tend to operate when doing your mastering at the moment?
For preference, I work in the box. You know, at this stage, I don't, it's not like I feel there's some magic ingredient that I can't get. Because, you know, one of my favorite sayings is that mastering is simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. And one of the things I mean by that is that 90% of what I do is EQ, compression, and limiting. You know, all the other stuff is nice to have, but you can do so much with just those three things. And I also think it's much less important what you use than the way that you use it. You know, so on the course that I teach, it's all about not so much what you do, but why you do it. What's your goal? What's your objective? How you know, what's the best way to achieve that? And I'm all about minimalism and all the rest of it. So yeah, I mean, it's funny because when I started work, one of the big selling points, one of the reasons that SRT got that recording contract with the RPO was that it was going to be all done 20-bit digital. So it was 20-bit digital recording, and then the Sadie editing offered, well, actually then 32-bit floating point processing, right? Which these days everybody has, but back then was a really big deal. And the studio that I was in, like that had a tape, one of the first ever 20-bit tape machines for doing multi-track recording there. So it was all about digital. these were the days when having DDD on your CD, meaning digitally recorded, digitally mixed, and digitally mastered, was actually seen as a good thing.
Yeah.
So I was trained very much, digital was all you need. I mean, for most of the time that I was there, I was using the TC Electronic System 6000, which is a hardware. It's not an in the box process, but it's 100% digital.
Yeah.
And I still love that stuff. They've just released the MD4 package as a plugin, unbelievably. So this thing that, I don't know what it cost. It was tens of thousands of pounds back then. You can now get it for 350 quid or something.
Amazing.
And I've been playing with the plugin, and it's like meeting up with an old friend again. It still sounds great to me. I mean, there's now you've got people like FabFilter doing all these amazing things. I think there's some features I would like them to add, but it's the algorithms still sound fantastic. So, excuse me.
It's all right.
So I was trained in the box, and I worked in the box I've done plenty of work on analog gear, and I love analog gear. Just stuff I always think about, Studio Tape Machine, because obviously, as well as mastering, I've done a lot of remastering, and ideally you get that from the original tapes. So it can be a bad thing when the edit has dried out and breaks apart, and you end up with an invaluable master tape all over in a tangled heap on the floor of the studio, and it takes 3 hours to untangle it. Yes, that happened.
Yeah.
But
oh no, didn't it?
also, just seeing the reels spin around, then stop on a dime, and it's beautiful engineering. And the same with valve gear, and I've mixed on Neve consoles and all the rest of it. So I love that stuff as much as anybody. But you need space for it. You've got maintenance. You don't have the recall. And it kind of pains me to say that the workflow and the practical aspects of it are important, but they really are, because and you'll find engineers, pro engineers in all areas of the industry saying this. When the competition are working in the box and could just recall a mix like that and do a tweak and send it back to you, you need to have that flexibility. So
definitely,
for me, if somebody wants some particular analog flavor, then I hire stuff in. It's but to be honest, most people don't ask what I use and are delighted with the results. So that tells me everything I need to know, really.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that, Ian. I was talking to a couple of engineers about this as well. I think it was Tim Palmer that mentioned it, and his thoughts was, I know that obviously we have all these like amazing all these like amazing graphs that come up when we're doing mastering, and all these like lovely colors and all that sort of stuff. But he said to me, he says, just sometimes maybe try and turn off your monitor and just listen to the music with what the music's actually doing, because I think I don't know what your thoughts are, but just so easily to just look at the graph. But I think someone made an interesting comment on our community a couple of days ago, actually, when I was asking, what questions would be good to pose to you from the community. And one of the guys actually said that, he said about loudness, that he reckons that a lot of people are really kind of stuck on this thing with -14 LUFS. And I'm guessing this is probably a conversation that you have quite frequently. You're probably there thinking, oh no, not this again. But it's like, people, I've been told this, but people, from my understanding, shouldn't be hung up on -14 LUFS. And yes, they should look at dynamics, but how do you serve the song in the best way when you've got people like Spotify telling you that -14 LUFS is the way to go?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's complicated business. Just quick, before we get onto loudness, just to comment about the turning the. I mean, I'm a sucker for a nice frequency display and graphical interfaces as anybody else.
Yeah.
But actually, so that first studio that I worked in for 10 years, I was using a digital desk at that point. It was the Yamaha DMC 1000. And it was an amazing thing, but it's solid aluminium flying faders built like a tank. 32-bit floating point processing. Actually, might not have been floating point, but anyway, 32-bit. And it had an LCD about this big that would show you a graph of the EQ. But actually, most of the time, it was so dim that I could barely see it. So I had a really low res, I think it was maybe an 8-band frequency meter, just showing the very broad kind of outline of the frequency shape. And I would keep an eye on that. But when I was choosing EQ and all the rest of it, and particularly when I was learning the craft, I was very much, doing what everybody does: boosting, sweeping, cutting, finding the problem frequency, notching it out. And I think that's really valuable. I think it is easy to get too reliant on the graph. And I saw a video by somebody saying, I think these things are a problem because let's say the track needs 24 dBs of something. Yeah. That looks insane on a graph on screen. And the risk is that you don't do it because it looks insane, even though it would have sounded great. And I think that that's a good point. I think there's a lot of validity to that. So yeah, I certainly try not to. I mean, I often will just stare straight ahead, so and just sweep because I've got a trackpad. So even if I'm doing it in the in software, you can still kind of have a physical feedback or even if you're using a mouse, and just listen and kind of try and feel it rather than look at it and measure it. I mean, the other interesting thing I would say is I think there's a temptation. You kind of think, oh, there's a problem in the low mids. You look at the frequency thing and you go, oh, okay, well, I can see a big lump at 200. So you grab it and you drag it down and you listen. And I keep listening. I go, that's not quite what I was looking for. And you sweep it up or down and you eventually find that actually it needs to be a little bit above or a little bit below. You know? So the frequency display will get you in the right ballpark, I often find, but often the perfect place musically is not necessarily where the pictures are telling you. So yeah, I think it's ironic, right? Because I've made plugins that metering plugins to help people visualize things, and I tell people to talk about LUFS and all the numbers and all the rest of it all the time. I don't actually use that stuff myself when I'm mastering. It's like, I mean, Dynameter is there on the screen, and I have the emulated VU meter, and I have a loudness meter and all the rest of it, but I'm listening and I'm doing it to make it sound and feel right, and then I'll check and that looks okay, and you move on. Or occasionally you look and go, oh, actually maybe that's a bit hot, is it? Okay, I'll listen again. So for me, meters are not telling you what to do, they're giving you useful feedback. They're giving you it's a reality check, or they prompt you to ask interesting questions. But at the end of the day, if it sounds right and the meter looks bad, that's fine. I'm gonna. It's tricky because people, when you've got a blog and a YouTube channel and podcast and all the rest of it, people ask questions and you want to be helpful. And in order to be helpful, often they want you to give them numbers. Yeah. And so I do that because I want to be helpful. Yeah. But also, there's a slight concern for me that it gives people the wrong impression about how I actually work and what I actually do. Yeah. And which actually brings us on to -14 LUFS, right? Because I have been talking on the blog about. I wrote a blog post in 2010 called "Spotify Will End the Loudness War," and I still believe that, but it hasn't happened yet. But ever since then, I mean, because I saw, they have loudness normalization. I was like, okay, well, they've done that not because of the loudness war, but because people find it annoying to have one song much louder than the other. But actually, what that means is when things are normalized, there's no advantage to having something super loud. And in fact, it could be a disadvantage if you end up damaging it in the process of getting it, or compromising it, let's say, in the process of getting it that loud. And then when it gets turned down, it can actually sound worse than it would have done if you hadn't pushed it super loud in the first place. Yeah. So I've been interested in that ever since, and talking about it because I feel like, it's a powerful argument to make people pay attention to these issues. Yeah. But that can also give people the false impression that I think that you should be aiming, that these numbers are something that you should aim at or pay attention to. The important thing is that everything is at roughly the same loudness. Sure. And I mean, okay, you can also predict what that loudness will be because you can make the measurement yourself and say, okay, if I make all of these -14 or -23 or whatever it is, how do they sound? But that's the important part of the process, right? That's
Sure.
It's like minus 14 is important because right now it's the level that Spotify and Tidal and YouTube are using.
Yeah.
But the really important thing about it is not that it's minus 14, but that what they are doing to the music in order to get to that distribution loudness.
Yeah.
So you could balance the loudness of the music in any way you like. And then
Sure.
when you make that fair comparison, then you get feedback about how everybody else is going to hear it. So you master it so it sounds great to you. And then you check. It's like, okay, that sounds good. But now how does it sound when I listen to it in comparison to such and such, both at minus 14? And it could be minus 16 or 18 or 23 or whatever. It doesn't matter, but if they're both at the same measured loudness, do I still like the way that my music sounds? And if the answer is yes, then you're good to go.
Yeah.
So what that means is when I'm mastering, well, okay, so here's another thing. The other question that people say is, well, I mean, for example, people say, well, I made all of the songs minus 14 and they don't sound the same loudness. And my reply to that is, well, no, why would you think that they would? Because if you make an acoustic ballad and a death metal song the same loudness, that's going to sound wrong because nobody expects an acoustic ballad to be as loud. You've measured them and you have made them the same loudness, but that's not musically appropriate.
Yeah.
So, when you're mastering an album, you don't make everything the same loudness. You balance the loudness. It's a question of balancing, not matching, right? You don't match the loudness, you balance it so that when you get to the quiet intro, it steps back a bit. Or, if you have an acoustic ballad amongst all this noisecore stuff, it sounds a bit softer. And the same thing applies. I mean, that's what everybody needs to do. So that also means that, putting everything to the same loudness is not musically appropriate and won't work musically, but also some of the streaming services will do that anyway. Yeah. So even if that was your goal, you don't need to because they're going to do it for you. And then the final kind of ingredient is what I think is an effective strategy, rather than saying, because the integrated loudness is the overall loudness of a song. So if you imagine AC/DC, Back in Black.
Yeah.
It starts loud, it continues loud, and it ends loud. It's loud all the way through. So if you took the loudness at any one point in that song and measured it, and then looked at the overall loudness, they're going to be similar because there's not much variety. Whereas if you take Stairway to Heaven, starts quiet, gets louder and louder and louder and louder and louder and louder, and then stops.
Yeah.
The loudness is different at every point. So the overall loudness is somewhere in between that quiet beginning and that loud ending. It's an overall value.
Yeah.
So if you match the overall value of those two, chances are Back in Black will sound too quiet in comparison to the end of Stairway to Heaven.
Right.
Whereas actually, by the end of Stairway to Heaven, it probably wants to sound musically about as loud as Back in Black.
Yeah.
Just, I'm just mad. This is my fantasy vintage metal album.
Sure. Brilliant.
So, they're overall readings. So trying to match overall readings or aim at overall readings, even if it wasn't minus 14, any number you aim at is probably going to be wrong, musically speaking. But what you can do is you can say, okay, well, let's listen to the loud sections. So my approach with any song is, when I get to the point where I'm deciding the overall loudness of it, is to listen to the loudest bit and decide how loud that's going to be.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of taste, whether you push it to the sort of extreme loudness of a lot of stuff these days, or you do something a bit more balanced like me, or even more dynamic like Bob Katz, because he loves dynamics even more than I do. Whatever you decide, if that becomes your reference point, right? So then everything else gets balanced musically in comparison to that.
Yeah.
So the loud sections of everything are made similar. And what you find then is that everything else just falls out naturally. The quiet ballad will be quieter. The quiet intro will be quieter, will build up to the right loudness. And of course, you can have some variation. You can have one song that's even bigger than all the others, if that's what you want. Yeah. But once you have that, you've established that reference point, then you can get this kind of, I think of it like a center of gravity running through all of the songs. And everything moves around that. And you'll get all kinds of different integrated loudness values. So the loudest stuff that I master probably goes up to minus 11 or minus 10.
Okay.
Overall.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, there's Skrillex is at -4.
It's
And actually,
crazy, isn't it?
Miley
Yeah.
Cyrus's last album was at -4 as well, which makes no sense to me.
No,
You know,
good
it's
grief.
like, okay, Skrillex might need to be at -4, but does Miley Cyrus need to be at
I
-4?
don't think so.
Does Kylie need to be at -4? Kylie's last album was at -4. You know,
Really?
that to me is insane, and that's where I get on my soapbox about dynamic range day. But whatever you decide about your overall level, you can choose it, and you can know something like 80-90% of people are going to hear stuff first on streaming. It's going to be normalized, regardless of how loud you master it. You're not going to have control of it, right? And it might come out well or it might not. The good news is you can test it, because we know what these streaming services do, and you can use the loudness penalty website that I made with meter plugs to preview it. And you can do that comparison where you go, okay, here's what it sounds like at the same level as everything. Am I happy? And you just tweak until you're happy, and then you can release it with confidence. And even if somebody listens to it on CD, the first thing that anybody does when they put it on a CD or listen on a site where the loudness isn't matched is they adjust the volume control themselves.
Yeah.
You know, so I really think the final volume is basically a non-issue, but everybody's hung up on it. And the real sadness that I see is that, you know, it's the artists and the engineers care the most about what the music sounds like.
Yeah.
You know, because it's their work, so they're worried about loudness, and they end up pushing it super loud, and it doesn't sound as good because they've made it so, you know, they have to take some of the bass out and they have to add extra distortion that they might not otherwise have done, and they reduce the musical contrast between the sections of the song more than they would otherwise have done, because they feel like it needs to be, and then it gets normalized or turned down by the listener, and nobody ever hears the benefits of that.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, people out there in the world don't care. They just care about the music. So the people who care about it most are, without realizing, doing it harm, and they didn't need to. You know, there wasn't any benefit. So, okay, I'll stop. I've been talking about it for ages.
Makes sense. No, that's amazing. Thanks so much, Ian. That's brilliant. I've got to ask you as well. So you've got an amazing podcast, which has now been running for a while, called The Mastering Show. You actually had on John Graham, if I'm right in pronouncing his name correctly. So Billie Eilish's engineer. I found that a fascinating interview that you did with him, because it is so damn loud, that album. Well, it feels loud, but maybe that's perception, you know. But it's just like, obviously with Billy and Phineas, and what they did is obviously they cranked up the bass, and it just feels like, you know, your speakers are pretty much rattling, but yet it works. And it just seems they kind of pushed it beyond boundaries with that. I mean, I don't know if that comes in at like -6 or -5 LUFS or whatever it is, but you know, that was a fascinating interview that you did with John about that. So what are your thoughts on albums such as, you know, Skrillex and obviously Billie Eilish as well, like with how loud that they push those albums?
I've got to admit, I like Skrillex. Makes me giggle.
Really?
And I find it super impressive. I can't help wondering whether all that talent, if it was put into other stuff other than just making it super loud. I mean, clearly there's a lot of talent there, and I enjoy the music as well. So but you know, I tend to think of it in terms of CPU process. You know, if he's got this much brain power, and this much is working on the loudness, and this much is on everything else, what about if you just reduced, you know, the
what else
loudness
could he
bit?
do?
And what else could he achieve?
Yeah.
And I have to say, actually, I'm more of a fan of his earlier stuff than the later things. I think the later things have not sounded as good, unfortunately. Haven't heard the most recent stuff. But, so yeah. But I also love the Billie Eilish record.
It's brilliant.
And yeah, I got John on because I made a video saying, you know, is Billie Eilish too loud? And my answer was no. Because there were lots of people getting upset about the track... I've forgotten the name of it. Zanny,
right.
Which has a super quiet intro, and then there's massive bassy, and there's loads of distortion in the bass. And all of that was intentional. All of that was done by Phineas. Yeah. You know, it's not a mastering fault. It's a creative decision. So I completely, and I just last week did an online event with the Audio Engineering Society, the AES. Cool. The chairman of that is a mastering engineer currently called Jonathan Weiner, who probably people have seen. You know, he does stuff for Isotope.
Yep. Lovely guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And I loved what he said about the Billie Eilish album, which is he said that album is just too bassy. You know, it just makes no sense. You put it on and the speakers crack up and all the rest of it, and it sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with him. And I mean, actually, you know, I mean, it does work, except it doesn't work in my car.
Yeah.
If I put that album on in my car at a point where the speakers don't split for the loud sections, you cannot hear her voice in the verse under the brown voice. You know,
No way.
you know, I don't have the best car in the world. It's fairly noisy in there, but
Yeah.
so in that sense, it doesn't work. But I love the album. I love the music, and I love the overall vibe of the album. So I think, you know, some people give me a hard time because like I say, people want help, so I offer them rules of thumb.
Yeah.
Right, and then other people come in and go, there are no rules in music, and they're absolutely right. And albums like Billy's album prove it. Except what they miss is rules of thumb. Right, a rule of thumb is all other things being equal, overall probably best to do this. But that's just a starting point. You know, that's just to get you in the right ballpark. It's like my idea of matching the loudest parts of the songs. That's something that's worked for me for my 25-year career, and I've taught it to over 1,000 people on the course, and it works for them as well.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean anybody has to do it. You know, it's not a rule. It's just my suggestion of a good idea to get you started to. Because all of this stuff is hard. Like I say, it's simple, but it's not easy. So to kind of get your head around it and start getting in there. So yeah, I think I completely support Skrillex's artistic right to be stupidly loud, and Billy's artistic right to be stupidly bassy, and anybody's right to be stupidly anything. What worries me is that in terms of loudness, there is this perception that you have to be super loud, right? You know, there are definitely people who are deliberately making, like the new Low album is insanely loud and insanely distorted, but it's what it's about. You know, the whole it's like an essay in distortion, that album. That's their artistic vision. I have no problem with that, but I do think probably the Kylie album would have sounded better if it hadn't been so loud and distorted. You know, and my concern is people doing stuff because they think, oh, we have to do this because it'll sell more records, or we have to do this because if we don't, nobody will take us seriously, or it won't. And none of that is true. You know, I mean, literally people have done actual academic research that shows that listeners don't really care about the overall loudness. They're not really aware of distortion or not. You know, it's all about the music. And I kind of feel like the great thing about the situation we're in now is it's actually an opportunity. It's like we don't have to worry about it. They don't care. We don't have to care about it as well. You can do what's best for the music, what you think is artistically right, and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, that's. I feel like loudness has become this kind of special case. I mean, I feel the same way about saturation. You know, people's objections to early digital was it was super clean and things could end up sounding sterile, and now we have all these tape emulation and saturation and all the rest of it, and that's great. Yeah, because you've got those creative opportunities, but I feel like people are overusing them, you know, to the point where most masters I get in, I'm trying to get more space and more clarity back out. Yeah. But I mean, that also comes down to my personal taste. So
absolutely, and this is really, thanks so much, Ian. And it's really interesting. I've talked to quite a few engineers about this, but we've all kind of agreed on one thing, that it's all about perception. So it's like literally there's however many billion people are on this planet, and I don't know what your thoughts are, but obviously everyone hears music and feels music in a different way as well. So like no human being's ears are exactly the same. Yeah, like you said, obviously we've got these amazing tools like you've got with meter plugs, you know, with your thing that, you know, the great meters. So at least we know that we're on track, but yet we can listen and feel the track as well when we're doing our work as well for an artist at the same time. But moving on from loudness to Dolby. So I know you touched on Dolby Atmos. So I know this is another hot topic in the audio community at the minute. Some people are saying it's the next best thing. Some people are saying, oh, it's just a fad. So I think it sounds amazing. And I'm trying to suss out at the minute, like where it's going and what's going to, you know, how it's going to be integrated into, you know, the normal average Joe's bedroom or living room as well. But what's your take on Dolby Atmos and where do you think it's going? And, you know, do you do it at the minute? Do you do Dolby Atmos mastering yourself or no?
No, it's a bit of a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing to say is there's no mastering as such for Dolby Atmos, because an Atmos mix is actually, it's almost like a virtual mix.
Yeah.
So So what I have done a load of surround sound work over the years, and I love surround sound. I love immersive audio. I love binaural audio. I loved working on 5.1 for DVD and Blu-ray.
Sure.
And Atmos sounds amazing too. Atmos is kind of the same thing, but it adds a height dimension. But the really clever thing about Atmos is, in a cinema, I can't remember how many. It's not channels because Dolby Atmos kind of the mix is made up of objects, and then you have metadata with those objects that tells them how they move. So, for example, if you had a vocal, you basically say to Atmos, the Atmos mixer, I want it to be center stage, or I want it to be over here, or I want it to be over there. When that gets encoded into the file, but it's not like it's bounced down to a track. When you did 5.1 in DVD, you had a left, center, right, and a rear surround, and a left surround, and a subwoofer channel, right? And those were discrete channels that was what the mix was. With Dolby Atmos, you have, here is the vocal, you need to put it there as an instruction. And then when it gets decoded, the decoder knows how many speakers it's got, and it will do the best that it can based on how many speakers. So if you're in a cinema with like 36 speakers and you say, pan the sound over my head, it's creating the impression you get there from 36 or more speakers in the room, right?
Yeah.
If you have a 9.1.2 system, so you've got 9 surround speakers, a subwoofer, and then or 9.1.4, 4 speakers overhead, that's a lot less than cinema, but the system will still go, okay, I'm going to make it sound the best that I can using those speakers. If you've got a 5.1, it'll make it sound the best that it can, but it's got no speakers above you to do it. And if you've only got a pair of earbuds, you've only got 2 speakers, but it will still try and make it sound like it's going over its head by doing what's called a binaural emulation. So binaural is this clever thing where that's a whole other thing, but it can sound quite like it's going over your head, even though there's only 2 speakers. So, but what that means is, like, if somebody said, I want you to master my Atmos mix, they could send me the Atmos master file or the mix file that they've got. When I import that into my DAW, I'm not going to get 6 channels. I'm going to get however many they had originally. So it could be 100 channels, right? The whole thing is there. It's not mastering in the sense that we're used to it. It's more like stem mastering, or even, I mean, you could in theory, you could remix it, because you could say, okay, well, there's the vocal. Actually, I'm going to put that behind me. Now, of course, you wouldn't.
No.
And I still think there's value in the mastering process, in the sense that if I import that into a completely beautifully calibrated room, I can say, okay, actually, I think there are still some things that need adjusting, which is basically what you're doing in mastering. But lots of mixers don't like it because it almost gives the mastering engineer too much power. So it's interesting because there's not this mastering thing. But it's incredibly exciting and clever because you have one mix or master that will translate to this enormous, will sound great on headphones and in a multi-channel listening environment or whatever the user has.
Sure. Yeah.
The problem is, in order to hear the really, I mean, the problem we had with DVD and Blu-ray is that not many people put 5.1 systems in their homes.
No.
It was very much an enthusiast, and the same concern is there for Atmos. The interesting thing that Atmos has that we didn't have then is things like smart speakers and sound bars. So the sales pitch is that, okay, you have this 3D surround sound immersive thing, and we're going to give the person at home that experience with this sound bar, which has speakers pointing in different directions, and it scans the room and it bounces the sound off the walls, and it ends up sounding as if they had a full Atmos rig. That's the sales pitch. Question is, will it match up to it in reality? I've heard some sound bars for kind of games and films. It sounds pretty impressive. You hear birdsong and atmospherics coming from around you. It sounds bigger and wider than you would imagine. What I haven't heard and haven't had the chance to test out yet is how music is going to translate to that. It might work, but I have to admit, at this point, I'm skeptical. Having said that, there are people working in it who are saying, "Oh, you wait, there's products coming that you're not going to believe." So in terms of what I think is going to happen, I think we don't know yet. I mean, it's really exciting. I would love to be working in it, but I personally can't justify the investment right now.
No.
If we get sound bars or smart speakers or whatever they are, devices that people buy in enough quantities that they care about having an Atmos version,
Yeah.
that's obviously going to be a huge opportunity for the whole industry. But I think it's quite a big if. I've spoken to, you talk to the people who are doing this stuff. One thing everybody agrees on is that artists, you put them in the middle of an Atmos mix and they love it.
Yeah.
Everybody just. But one of the reasons they might love it, in my opinion, just to go slightly off topic, is because it has such great dynamics. Because one of the interesting things about Atmos is that they specify minus 18 LUFS should be the overall level for an Atmos project. So that means you're, unlike CD streaming, all the rest of it, it's kind of like broadcast. You're not allowed, if you like, to master super loud. And actually it doesn't work because, technically speaking, you think about all those channels there and all that metadata and the instructions on how to render it.
Yeah.
It's just not possible to optimize that for every possible speaker configuration that it might end up on if it goes super loud. Sooner or later, you're going to get a couple of channels added together if it's all going to crack up. So that's why they've specified this lower level. And it means that all of these Atmos mixes have more dynamics. And I think that's one of the things that people really love about them. Is just the bass really hits and it's got all this contrast. And I actually have chosen to download the Atmos version of not the first Billie Eilish album, but the second one onto my phone, just because the dynamics are so much better than the CD master.
Oh, right. Brilliant.
I genuinely think if you want to hear that album sounding at its best, you should listen to the Atmos, even on earbuds.
Yeah.
Honestly, the short answer is I don't really know. I think it's exciting. I think there are opportunities if you're in a position where you can invest, and there's lots of work right now.
Yeah.
The question is, how long will people carry on paying a decent amount for that work to be done? And will that's the question. Everybody in the industry is really excited about it. Does anybody outside the industry know or care?
Absolutely.
And will they continue to care, and will they buy systems that enable them to experience the true benefits of it? I think it definitely works for films and stuff. Especially with the head tracking thing that you get with the Apple AirPods. Yeah. All of that is super effective. I'm not 100% convinced myself that is as successful for music. I think it's really interesting.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
This space.
Absolutely. Yeah. To be fair, I think with my other half, if I ended up setting up a Dolby Atmos, that's like a home setup in my living room, I think she'd probably go absolutely nuts, to be fair, with all the speakers everywhere. But what does interest me as well, so we touched on Wavelab. I love Nuendo as well. And I know that there's Dolby Atmos is integrated into there. And then like you've touched on with binaural as well. So I've spoke to a couple of pro engineers, and they said that for their artists, they're actually experimenting under headphones with binaural, and that's the way that they're actually, because they haven't got the budget to get the speakers, and that's the way that they're approaching it as well. So I'm really interested about binaural. Have you played around with any binaural stuff as well? Have you played around with any of the binaural software yet? Or
yeah, I did 2 YouTube videos about Atmos for that, because I think one of the interesting things is that most people are going to hear Atmos, themselves, on AirPods or on earbuds, in stereo, which means a binaural render.
Sure.
So, one of the most important things if you're mixing in Atmos is to make damn sure that it sounds really good in binaural. I've played with it. You can, Logic now supports it built in, the latest version. I haven't used that, but pretty much anybody can download the Dolby Atmos renderer from Dolby's site. You can get a free 3-month trial of it. It works as a plugin in a DAW, and then you have the renderer application running alongside it, and it sends the audio out to that, and you can play with the binaural thing. And I think, that's, if it does take off, I think that's an opportunity for mastering engineers potentially, because if people are trying to mix on headphones, they won't really have any idea how that's going to sound in a multi-channel speaker system. You know, that's a really difficult. I mean, even people that I've spoken to who have full-blown Atmos systems, and they say they start out mixing in binaural and then switch to the speakers and check. There's a big learning curve, I think, to be able to do that, to mix in binaural and have it translate to. So what that means is they're going to need somebody in a mastering role, to check that stuff before it goes out. So to take, and I mean the other thing is, I'm sure people, you know, in theory, all the speakers need to be matched, and they all need to be time aligned and phase calibrated, and you know the angles need to be perfect and all the rest of it. In practice, what will happen is people will take the system they have and add some extra speakers and work with that, and it will sound pretty good but not quite right. So that's when you have again this kind of mastering role where somebody comes in and says, okay, I see what you wanted to do there, it'll work even better if we can tweak this and adjust, you know, refine that and all the rest of it. So I mean I think that's again, it's interesting and it's an opportunity. What was your question?
No, about the binaural. It's about, you know, kind of using binaural. Just wondering if you have used it. And you said that obviously you have used it, and it's just an exciting technology, I suppose, that we can all explore as well.
I think it's a really clever idea. That was where I got quite excited about Atmos, was because, you know, the problem was, I mean, when we were working for 5.1, it was all about, okay, so this sounds great on the speakers, but now we have to check how it's going to sound in stereo. And what we would do, and so DVD players would have an automatic mix down function, which often sounded poor. So we would always give people a stereo mix as well, but very often the budget wasn't there to do a completely independent 5.1 and stereo mix. So we would mix the 5.1 with the idea that we were going to take effectively those stems and then create a custom fold down, if you like, for the stereo version. So it wasn't a from the bottom up stereo mix. It was a kind of hybrid, you know, it was an optimized version of the 5.1 for stereo. And that's kind of what Atmos gives you here, except binaural has the potential to offer you the illusion of sounds coming from behind you or above your head. I mean, the interesting thing playing with it is it's not perfect by any means. It can be quite effective and it can fall completely flat. And one of the things is that the current software uses effectively an average human head. You know, they've taken a wide range of dimensions, because the whole point about binaural is basically the shape of your head and the shape of your ears influences the sound that reaches you. And actually your brain can kind of decode that like a fingerprint, right? So if you can, for example, when you vary the height, if you play pink noise and vary the height, we hear a notch that kind of runs down through the frequency spectrum depending on the height. And that's one of the clues that tells our brain how high. But that is individual for everybody in terms of their ear shape. But if you add a notch to a piece of audio in the right place based on roughly the right ear shape, it will give people some impression of height. And if your head happens to match perfectly the average that they've used, you'll get a stunning result.
Amazing.
Potentially in future, though, when you go to buy a mobile phone, they could do a 3D scan of your head, including your ears, and your phone could then have a customized binaural profile. And instead of using the averaged one currently there, it would give you a customized binaural. And so, you know, just like if you're going to use SonarWorks with a pair of headphones, you need a bespoke profile for your headphones. If you had a bespoke binaural profile for your head, then there's the potential that this would sound really quite amazing. Because, I mean, one thing is I have a pair of binaural mics myself that I bought a few years ago. You wear them. You put the mics in your ears and then you can record. So you use your own head. So that gives me a perfect binaural fingerprint for the music that I record on. It's absolutely spooky. The first time I got it for Christmas, and the first time I played with it, I was in the living room and I was just recording a bit of audio, and I realized, well, I don't have any headphones to listen to it on. So I came in here, plugged in the 650s, and suddenly thought, oh my God, I've turned the monitoring on by mistake. You know, and it took me a couple of seconds to realize, no, I haven't. I'm listening to the binaural recording I just heard, And the impression I'm getting of the TV being in the room is so lifelike that I thought my monitors had come on.
Wow.
So when it works, it's amazing, and it's really exciting.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thanks so much, Ian. Last couple of questions for you. So I've got to ask you. I was talking to one of our moderators on our community about this. Is with mastering about maybe gain staging, but I suppose my question is more in lines with when you are mastering in the box. How many limiters are you using? I know that some engineers like to use 2 or 3 limiters and just use a tiny bit of limiting as they're going along. Because I know that some people have argued, they said, well, how's that really going to help the master? Because surely you're in a digital format, so surely you can just use one limiter. But do you find that using 2 or 3 limiters when you are mastering in the box format, do you reckon is that how you work? Do you use a couple, or do you use just gain? Do you instead? Is that how you approach it instead?
I use as little limiting as possible.
Okay.
And personally, I only ever use one.
Okay.
What I do use is usually a combination of compression and limiting.
Yeah.
And occasionally I will use some soft clipping or some saturation as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, the idea of the multiple limiters is kind of to share the load.
Yeah.
I don't think it makes sense in theory. And actually, this question got asked on a forum on Facebook that I'm part of the other day. And Fabian Tokyo Dawn, who makes the Tokyo Dawn plugins, so
yeah,
the Nova TDR Nova EQ and Limiter 6, and amazing plugins, really, really affordable. Definitely check them out.
Absolutely.
He really knows his stuff, and he kind of answered this question and said people might like to do that, but it's almost a limiter is designed to control the peaks as cleanly as possible. They're designed based on transient information coming out, transient material coming in, limited material going out.
Yeah.
How to get those as close as possible to each other. Usually, then you might add flavors and you might all the rest of it, but the goal is how can I be as clean as possible. He says as soon as you're not feeding them clean input, all of those assumptions kind of go by the wayside, right?
That makes sense.
If you give them something that's already been limited, and this is my experience, if you limit something that's already been limited, you might be able to get it louder, but you're basically doing that at the expense of more distortion, because the second limiter is not able to do its job as effectively as it would have done if it had been given completely clean material.
Gotcha.
So now, having said that, I also sometimes use a soft clipper prior to a limiter, and a soft clipper is going to also mess up those transients.
Yeah.
But for me, the times when I do that is when I'm feeling like the limiter is too clean, when I want more aggression, when I want to keep. And basically, with a clipper, limiters tend to sound cleaner, clippers tend to sound more distorted. The question is it good distortion? Is it musical? Does it work?
Yeah.
So those are the things you trade off. What I was going to, in terms of, excuse me, using compression and limiting. The problem with a compressor is it's not a great way of controlling stuff like drums.
Yeah.
If you pull the attack time, I mean, it can be creatively, but in terms of mastering, so rewind slightly. One of my goals personally when I'm mastering is to be as invisible as possible.
Sure.
I don't want to listen to something and go, wow, listen to the job Ian Shepherd did on that. I want somebody to listen and go, wow, listen to what a great recording that is by Fred, or whatever.
Sure.
And oh, I love this song. It makes me want to laugh. It makes me want to dance. It makes me want to sing. That's the important stuff. I don't want people going, listen to the compression on that. That's amazing. So I want my stuff to be as invisible as possible. So if you try and use a compressor, for example, to control drums, you have to ramp the attack time down so fast that usually it can suck all of the life out of them. Yeah. Whereas a limiter is designed to cleanly deal with transients. So what I like to do when I'm mastering is usually have a longer attack time than people are probably used to in recording and mixing, which doesn't really do anything for the transients, but it controls the body of the sound, and it does that really well and really gently. And then the limiter can control the transients really cleanly. So I share the load between the two of them, and they work on different bits of the musical signal. Because if you try and heavily limit a vocal or a bass, it just sounds ugly.
Yeah.
But really clean limiting on drums can work really nicely. And compression on drums probably doesn't work, but compression on vocals and bass works great because of the longer, you've got gentler ratios, longer attack and release times. So that's why I do it that way. And then, as I say, I might bring in something like saturation or soft clipping or something if I need more kind of aggression from that sound. So having said all that, there are definitely people who use multiple limiters, and if they get a result they're happy with, that's all well and good. But I tend to find that's usually how I can achieve even more loudness. And in my experience, you achieve the extra loudness by the addition of more distortion. So then it's just a question of whether that's artistically appropriate or not.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Ian. That's absolutely brilliant. Right, so we've had a few comments come through from people just saying, really, to be fair, how much they've enjoyed today, how much they've enjoyed having you on today. And thank you so much as well. It's been an absolute blast exploring your world and picking your brains as well. It's been brilliant. We've had a couple of comments come through just saying from a couple of people on Facebook saying, huge fan of your work and content, Ian. And another user saying, mastering to me feels like a form of magic, sorry. So this is really awesome. I have mastered my own tracks, but never to the extent of success of you. So you're awesome. They're saying on there. So it's a huge testament to you, Ian, and the work that you've done. It's absolutely phenomenal. And it's brilliant as well. The amount of knowledge that you share as well is amazing. So people like yourself, Bob Katz, Warren Hewitt, educators, giving us all this education. It's really, I feel, is really paving the way for the next generation as well. It's the kind of people that are really wanting to get into the audio game. Education's so important, and we've got this fantastic tool now that you can share as well. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, that was one of the reasons I started it out. it's when I started blogging initially, that was the first thing that I did before YouTube or the podcast. It was just, there's this opportunity to get good information out there, but a lot of the information that's out there is, in my opinion, not good. So I wanted to start giving good information. And it's funny because I remember my friend and used to be my colleague Nick Watson from Fluid Mastering in they were in London. He's just moved out to Bristol, but at one point he called me an educator, and I was like, what? That's weird. But he was like, no, you're going to have to own it. You have one of the things you do now is be an educator. And I was kind of like, okay, fair enough. But it was really nice at the AES event I mentioned last week. A couple of the other people who were co-presenting, there was Shane Slack and Elaine Rasnick, who's younger up and coming mastering engineers. Cool. And they did a section there about, how to move from being an enthusiast to being a pro and dealing with imposter syndrome and feeling that and knowing how much to charge and all this kind of stuff and how to find mentors. And actually Elaine said, well, he doesn't know this, but Ian was actually my first online mentor. And then Shane popped up and said, me too. And I was actually, that made me feel really good, because
that's brilliant.
And because the original experiment was, if you give people good information, will they find it useful? Will they like that? Will they trust you? And, eventually maybe ask you to do some work for them. And my experience is that, yes, that works. But, that only applies to like 1% maybe of the people who watch my videos or listen to the podcast or whatever. Yeah. And that means everybody else out there gets useful, interesting information, which, it's a win-win, right? It's a great thing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ian. And I know that imposter syndrome is a massive thing. We've talked about it on the community with a few members. I was interviewing, he's become quite a good friend, Tony Jack the Bear Mance, the great mastering engineer from Australia, which I'm sure you're aware of. And, we were having a really big conversation about imposter syndrome as well. And so many people there thinking, so-and-so, they've done this and that, and I'm not going to ever make it. And at the end of the day, we all bleed red, don't we? It's like we're all here to kind of learn from one another and educate one another. And it's great that people like yourself and, like I said, like Warren Hewitt and many others, and Jonathan Weiner are just helping pave the way for the next generation, because we need educators to help educators. So we're not having to deal as much with imposter syndrome. So we're still going to get imposter syndrome, I suppose, but you know,
I still get it.
It helps us. Yeah, I bet.
Well,
Really?
But another example from last week is that the third session was a breakdown of a mastering session by Piper Payne, who's amazing US engineer.
Yeah, she's awesome.
And Oscar Zambrano as well. And the two of them were saying, well, it got to one point and they had their example mix or master, and they were talking about it and saying, you know, really the goal is not to change anything. You know, if somebody decides something in the mix, that's their decision. It's not up to us to put any kind of. And I actually typed in the chat to Ian Stewart, who also does some stuff for Isotope, was there as well. I was like, okay, now I've got imposter syndrome. I feel like maybe I do too much in my mastering. It happens, right, to everybody. And I think, you know, it's just something that we all have to deal with and work with. You know, you just get to the point where, you know, the thing to do is get your feet wet. Yeah. You know, start doing work, offering it maybe initially just to friends for free or whatever. Start getting feedback, and when that feedback starts getting positive, then you know you're doing it right. You know, that's the point where you can just kind of say, okay, any doubts and concerns I have, and they're going to continue, but if people appreciate what I'm doing, and you know, then we're good to go.
Absolutely. That's so good. Thanks, Ian. Last question for you. What's next on your journey? Have you got any plans for the future, or is continuing as you're doing everything at the minute, like with your podcast and educating and mastering?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to keep going with everything that I'm doing. Future plans are, well, I mean, you know, people really like the loudness penalty plugin, and quite a few people have been asking for a standalone application for it. Awesome. So something where you can drag multiple files on and get more information, basically. So that sounded like an interesting idea. So we asked the user base whether they liked it, and 96% of them said yes, they wanted that. So that's something that I'm thinking about at the moment. Honestly, I've got a ton of ideas. The challenge is finding time to put them all into practice.
Definitely. Absolutely amazing. Thanks so much, Ian. And thanks everyone that's joined us. Ian, feel free to hang out just for a couple of minutes if you're free once we've ended this live. But no, Ian, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to everyone that's joined us. So Ian, a couple of your websites to join. So for tutoring, what's your web address?
If you head over to productionadvice.co.uk, that's the main blog and where I post the YouTube videos and stuff. You might also like to check out the podcast, which is at themasteringshow.com. And if you're interested in the plugins I mentioned, then they are at meterplugs.com.
Brilliant, fantastic. Yeah, and definitely I advocate that everyone listens to Ian's show as well. I've listened to many episodes in the car. Absolutely fantastic. Some brilliant guests on there as well. So, and again, so everyone, you probably might see this today as well, Ian. So it's our 1 year birthday today. So the community's been going, thank you very much. Seems quite strange saying that, but yeah, we've been going for 1 year now. We're also a community of now 3,000 engineers. So we've just passed that mark as well, which is absolutely fantastic. So do feel free to share the community with your friends. So if you're watching on Facebook, feel free to go over to youtube.com/produce mix fix and conquer, and also feel free to hang out in our community, which is facebook.com/groups/produce mix fix and conquer, which Ian is one of our experts on there as well. So feel free to drop in some questions on there as well. But Ian, thanks so much for your time today. It's been brilliant.
No, my pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Thank you.